Good afternoon. I'm Jim Townsend. I'm the director of the Carl Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy at Wayne State University Law School in Detroit. And it's my great pleasure to begin moderating this second panel. What we're going to do in this panel is really try to integrate some of the things or pick up on some of the things that we heard in the first panel and talk about how state lawmakers are integrating their work in legislating with their work in doing oversight. But I want to begin first by just thanking Daniel Stid and Lyceum Labs for organizing this event and really taking the laboring oar and making this all come together. And as far as sort of what happened in the last panel, one thing I do want to mention to Daniel is that I think next time we need to have Snickers bars in the lunches. I think there's a strong feeling about Snickers bars. So just a little note for our next event. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then I'll kick things off with some questions. Well, starting to my immediate right, Senator Sarah Gelser-Bluen began her state legislative career in 2005 in the Oregon House of Representatives. She was later elected to the Oregon State Senate in 2014, where she still serves. Senator Gelser-Bluen is chair of the Senate Human Services Committee, and she also serves on the Judiciary Committee, the Education Committee, the Mental Health Committee, and the Joint Transportation Committee. People in the Senate serve on a lot of committees. Senator Gelser-Bluen has gained wide recognition for her oversight and legislative work related to child welfare and the state foster care system, where she uncovered significant problems in the system. And the work she did in oversight and then the follow-up she did in legislation led to some significant reforms in that area that have been really recognized around the country. She's received numerous awards. I don't have time to list them all, but I will mention one. She was appointed by President Obama to serve on the National Council on Disability. Sarah lives in Corvallis, Oregon, with her partner, Dr. Michael Bluen, and she's the proud mother of 5 children. Our next panelist is Senator Jeff Brandes. I guess soon to be former Senator Jeff Brandes. Jeff is a lifelong resident of St. Petersburg, Florida. He's a veteran and he's a businessman. He followed a long line of members of his family in joining the military in 1996 in the Army Reserve, and he was called up to active duty in Operation Iraqi Freedom. He served in Iraq in the 101st Airborne as an officer, as a transportation officer, and he was awarded the Combat Action Badge. Jeff served in the legislature from 2011 to 2022, both in the House and the Senate. He chaired the Senate Committee on Transportation and also several appropriation subcommittees. He is a nationally recognized policy leader in areas as diverse as autonomous vehicles and mobility, flood insurance, and criminal justice reform. Jeff.
This means I have schizophrenic policy knowledge.
And then finally, our third panelist is Alan Weissman. He's co-director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking. He is chair of the Political Science Department at Vanderbilt University and the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Political Economy. He has research and teaching interests in American political institutions, positive political economy, focusing on legislative politics, regulation, and bureaucratic policymaking, and business government relations. Alan previously taught at Ohio State University and at Northwestern. And he is the author of the book, The Internet Economy, Access, Taxes, and Market Structure, and of numerous articles in leading political science journals. So, moving on. So with those introductions, I want to kick this panel off by asking our lawmakers about their experience in passing legislation. Could you just maybe point to the legislative accomplishment for which you're most proud? What, if you had to pick one or two, what would be the thing that stands out most to you? And what were the hurdles you had to overcome in order to, get it over the finish line?
Want me to go first? Yeah. Sure. Of all of the things you mentioned, my proudest legislative accomplishment has nothing to do with any of those. It happens to do with an issue on parenting time plans. One of the things I'm sure you all have is you have mothers and fathers who don't get married and have children out of wedlock. And one of the challenges is when you have that is oftentimes dads are disengaged because there's no simple process for them to be engaged as fathers. And so we created a very streamlined, simple process for dads to get into a parenting time plan, kind of a default parenting time plan, so that if they can agree very quickly, they can see, they can get a parenting time plan and get at least 20% time with their kids. And it's very simple and straightforward, and they don't have to think about anything. And so to me, if you think about, when I think about what are the biggest problems in this country and what are some of the biggest challenges, I think the number one problem the country faces was something that Charles Murray described in the book called Coming Apart, where he looked at families, and he says, we've never seen as many fatherless families in the history of America, or frankly in the history of time, as we've seen in the last couple of generations. And so how do we address that? And I think parenting time is kind of a meaningful way of allowing that to happen. So if there was one big idea, it wouldn't be self-driving cars, it wouldn't be criminal justice reform, it definitely wouldn't be flood insurance. It would be, how do we get dads to spend more time with their kids?
So I'm, in different audiences, I would have different answers to that question. And I think in general, I spend a lot of my time working on child welfare reform, residential care, and trying to work on some of that at the national level. But for purposes of this question, in terms of what a barrier is to get there, I think the hardest bills I've ever worked to pass surprised me, and those came during the pandemic. And those had to do with the inadequate access to health care for people that experienced disability, because of how clear the ongoing discrimination in healthcare and really all of our systems, education as well, continues to persist for people with disabilities. And it was shocking to see how acceptable really it was to allow overtly discriminatory things to happen. So some of the efforts that I worked on around that were early on in our state, making sure that people with disabilities were able to have a support person with them in the hospital, regardless of the hospital visitor policies. This was important because I can think of a particular case in particular where an adult woman with an intellectual disability went into the emergency room. Her group home operator had taken her there. They took her back. She had COVID. She needed a ventilator. They got this woman to sign a do not intubate order, so she did not get the ventilator. The hospital called the group home and said that she had decided she did not wish to have an intubator or to have life-saving treatment. The group home said, one, someone should have been there with her. Two, she has a guardian. And three, that's not consistent with anything we know about her plans. Please put her on a ventilator. And it took the intervention of a number of people to get her moved actually to a different hospital, which happened just in time for her to be able to get a ventilator, and she is alive today. So there were two things that happened there. One, someone needing to be there. And we were able to get that passed in June of 2020 in a special session. I was really proud of fighting really hard and bringing unusual coalitions together in order to get it added to an agenda, even though it wasn't part of an agreed to list. And it may be the only bill in history that had both SEIU, who I often work with, and Oregon Right to Life working together to put something together. And people were very thoughtful about which letterheads they put on and who they described were working on things, but it's one of those things. There are no permanent friends and there are no permanent enemies in politics. But one of the things that came out of that bill in that session, and it was one of those, you've got to make a quick decision of, do you get everything or do you get part of what you want, even if it's painful to leave something behind? In the committee, it was clear the bill would not pass if we kept the language that just very specifically reiterated federal civil rights protections, that you cannot withhold medically necessary care from an individual on the basis of their race, nationality, disability, or age. People were fine with all the other protected class statements in that statute, but they wanted age especially and disability taken out. So we did that, and I brought that back in the 2021 session, ultimately passed it. It was the hardest bill I have ever ever worked on, including until after it passed, because the hospital associations, the medical association continued to try to get it vetoed. But it was an incredibly important bill, and I was so grateful to the people that stood forward. But it was one of those where deeply held biases that are very difficult to talk about, not willing to stand down, and just the willingness to be able to work with people that you can't just say there's people you're not willing to work with.
So in both, really important pieces of legislation that were not necessarily very easy to pass, I want you to now imagine yourself, now both of you had the benefit of having quite a bit of experience in the legislature. Imagine though you're talking with a newly elected member of the Senate, let's say. What sort of, what would be the one or two things you might tell them about how they can advance their legislative agenda? How can they get bills that mean a lot to them and their constituents passed?
Well, first, figure out what your legislative agenda is. I mean, most legislators come in and they're like the dog who caught the car. They don't know what they want to do, right? They've gone through all this. You heard this in the first panel. Like you've gone through all of this. You've now been elected, and they go, all right, now what? And understand they know nothing about anything. I mean, they don't know about any of these topics for the most part, right? I mean, you throw a brand new legislator in, and you say, all right, work on, now you're on the insurance committee, you're on the criminal justice committee, you're on all these other committees. I started on the criminal justice committee. I had no background in law, right? I'm a Christian. I'm not an attorney. So you have to figure these types of things out, right? And so my one piece of advice when young legislators come see me is pick a topic, don't care what it is, and learn it better than everybody else. Like understand that one area of policy, make yourself indispensable in one area of public policy, preferably on a committee you sit on because it's really helpful. But understand one piece of policy, and after you've done that for 2 or 3 years, then do a second, and if you're lucky, maybe you add a third. And so to me, what most legislators try to do is shotgun this thing, and they say, well, I'm going to be a generalist. Well, that means you're great at nothing. But if you understand one area of policy, and you go to the conferences, and you meet the experts, and you build this kind of expert network around you, you're able to then ask better questions. So I always want to see a legislator, like my litmus test for freshmen is I don't expect them to get bills passed, but I do expect them to, if I see one, file an independent amendment. Like no lobbyist came to them, they saw a problem in a bill, they worked to file an amendment, get it heard, I don't care whether it gets on or not, but they worked to do that. To me, that says, hey, I cared enough to actually, work through the afternoon or through the evening to solve a problem on a bill that I saw independently. 9 out of 10 legislators won't do that because it's too hard. And I kind of cut my teeth on this because when I was in the House many, many years ago, I filed an amendment on a governor's priority bill in a committee that I did not sit on and had to go present it myself. And nobody does that. But it was on, should we drug test welfare recipients? And I felt pretty passionately that the answer should be no, because we don't get to I'm a private property person and believe in the Fourth Amendment, and I don't believe we should be able to test your blood because you're poor. And the governor and the legislature had a different perspective on that. But I remember some pretty passionate arguments, and I think that set me apart from my colleagues in this discussion because I was willing to step up and take on an issue like that. But for me, you've got to find these litmus tests for young legislators. And so number one, find something you're passionate about and dive into it and learn it better than everybody else. And you'll become indispensable to the process.
I agree with all of that. I think another piece, and it seems like it goes without saying, but read the bills. And read the bills that you have drafted, because it doesn't matter what your intention is, it's the words on the page that matter. Every word on the page matters. I also think it's more important to be accurate than to be fast. So I would much rather, and I would talk with folks about, even if your bill is going to have a higher bill number, even if it doesn't get pre-session filed, if you get it back and there's mistakes in it, get it as close to perfect in your mind as you can before you introduce it, because you'll lose time in negotiation if you're having to explain what is just a mistake in the draft that you didn't really mean. That all becomes part of the process. So take the time, read the words. And then the other part that I think is really important is recognizing the difference between aspirational legislation and legislation that is pragmatic and really makes a difference. I think we oftentimes like to pass legislation on really big issues so that we can say that we have done something. But if you pass the bill and you have your signing ceremony or your press release where we say, rah, rah, we did this, but you're not able to look back a year later or 2 years later and talk about where did that really play out in a way that made the lives of some people in our state better, you didn't really get anything done. So that means once you pass it, you need to follow it. You need to follow it through the rulemaking process. You need to follow it through how it gets played out in the community. You need to hear when it's not working well so that, good policy changes. That means you might be working on the same topic, making modifications to things you've done before, session after session after session. That doesn't mean it was a bad product when you put it through the first time. It just means that you recognize that the law is a living document. And if you aren't willing to change it, if you aren't willing to adjust it, it's just not going to be successful.
Yeah, it's music to the Levin Center's ears. Oversight. But before we turn to matters of oversight, I want to ask you about working across the aisle. We heard from the panelists some really heartfelt and articulate accounts of how they've managed to do it from their perspectives. You serve in different kinds of legislatures with different party control. Tell us about how you've managed to build relationships across the aisle and get bills passed.
Well, in Florida, we have 2/3 Republican control of both chambers, so we don't have to do any of that. But for the most, look, I mean, my best friend's a Democrat, and I lived with him when I was at Tallahassee, so that made it pretty easy for us to have conversations. So we were always kind of debating and understanding, and it helped because I'm a libertarian with a capital L and a Republican with a little r, so neither party really knew what to do with me, and that was a good thing because I could kind of vote my own conscience, and I felt comfortable. And what I realized, and I don't, many other legislators, I don't know if they understand this, but like most people have no clue what you do in this process, right? I mean, I was probably one of the most quoted legislators in my local area, and I still only had 6, 7, 8% name ID, and nobody really knew what I was working on at any one time. And when I figured that out, that was great. It was actually very freeing because I could work on whatever I wanted, and that to me was, as long as I felt like it was important and it was worth my time, effort, and energy, was very freeing to me to be able to work on that. So to me, working across the aisle is caring about the issue and not caring about the policy, right? Caring about the issue and not caring about how we get there, right? So many people confuse motion for progress in the legislative world, where ultimately, what I always think chairmen of committees should have to do is talk about the outcomes that they want to achieve first. And one of the things you rarely see as a chairman, they just push things through committee without ever saying, hey, before we start, here's the outcome I'm going to achieve. I remember I sat on a committee, the Judiciary Committee. I chaired it for 1 year before I got kicked off and moved on because I voted against the Senate President on a couple too many things. But I remember staying in the committee, and my first statement to the committee is, I'm not going to put anything before this committee that I'm not planning to vote on myself. And it was like a hush went through the audience, like, oh my gosh. Now, most chairmen will sometimes move things through, and sometimes they'll vote no on things, but sometimes it's a quiet no. And I took a position that I was not going to be a quiet no on anything. I was just going to tell you where I was, and if I wasn't there, that's what next year's for, and that's what term limits are for. You'll see in 8 years on certain pieces of policy. But those types of statements made by the leaders set the tone for a committee, and frankly sets a trust for the committee that the chairman of the committee at least is not going to put his committee through things that he's not willing to stand by himself. And to me, that's a powerful statement. And then, again, focusing on the outcomes that you want to achieve.
I'm thinking of three of my current and former colleagues in particular. The first was a man, he's now left this world, but his name was Max Sumner, and I met him my first year in the legislature, and we were at, I think it was the CSG Western Leadership Academy. We were riding on this dark bus, and he said, you know what, you're my friend. And even though you're my friend, when the election season comes, I'm going to give money to the person that runs against you and go knock on doors in your district and tell them to vote for the other guy. And then we're going to come back and we're going to be friends again. You just have to remember, if you're going to survive here, that's not personal, because you're going to do the same thing to me. And that helped a lot to keep that in mind. It's a weird workplace where you work together and we all say we want to work together, and then we go out and literally kind of beat people up in front of their communities and unfortunately try to embarrass each other and talk about each other's worst qualities. Generally, that's not considered a great way to build a relationship. But keeping that in mind and understanding that we're all there, that makes a difference. The second, I had another colleague named Sherry Springer, very conservative Republican, and I'm a pretty progressive Democrat, and we were on a committee together, and there was a mistake that I had made in a committee that I chaired, and I wanted to fix it in a committee that we both served on, that it had been referred to. And I knew that she agreed with me because she was also on that committee. I also knew that her caucus would be livid with her if she said yes. So I went and asked a senior member of her caucus if she would have a meeting with this representative and myself. This was Sherry's first session. And I sat in that meeting and I said the things I would normally say and said, would you please support me on this amendment? And she started to talk, and the other representative, Representative Berger, said, would you just give us a second? So I walked out of the room and I came back in, and Sherry said, no, I am not going to be able to support you with that. And then we walked out of the room, and she was kind of mad. She's like, why is this way? And I said, well, it's like theater. We all have lines that we're supposed to read and roles that we play in this process. My job was to ask you, and your job was to say no. And it would have been wrong of me to take advantage of you not having the script book yet. You would never be able to trust me. And that, I think, was a really important thing in both of our relationships, and she did the same for me in years after. The final thing is really supporting people, even on the other side of the aisle. You can disagree with something, you can vote against something, and also recognize that it's really, really important to them. I have written notes to people when bills or amendments they've brought forward that are deeply important to them don't pass, even when I voted against them, to acknowledge the work that goes into that. One of my very best friends is a guy named Dwayne Stark. He's leaving. This is his last session. He's moving to Texas, and he is an extraordinary human being, very, not in favor of abortion rights. I'm very in favor of abortion rights, and when we passed a really comprehensive Reproductive Rights Act in the Oregon legislature, I went over and sat with him because I knew that was a hard day for him. I wanted to honor what that experience was like for him. And he is just truly one of my very best friends. We bounce things off of each other. We are able to go to each other for a reality check. I walked into my office earlier this week and he was sitting outside my door, and it was kind of embarrassing because the lobby was there, and I involuntarily burst into tears. I was so happy to see him. And on Friday evening, he laid on a box outside my office because he was getting on a plane to go to Texas, and he wanted one last check-in before we could leave. And those relationships are incredibly, incredibly important. And it's helpful with the politics too. So I can go and say, why am I having this difficulty with your leader? Or he can come and say, what is really going on? Like, what is this really about? And that is really helpful and keeps us honest about we're all people. And I liked what was said before. You come as you are, and you get the title, and you get kind of dehumanized. Everybody comes with feelings and relationships, and people are passionate about the work. Even when you disagree, I think you can honor the passion that people bring to their work.
Well, thanks so much for that. With the time we have left, I want to turn things to Alan. I want to ask you about the Center for Effective Lawmaking and the research and analysis that the center is doing. Tell us about your mission and some of the things you're learning that are relevant to making lawmakers better at doing their jobs.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Jim. And also let me thank everyone, or let me join in the thanks of everyone to thank Daniel Stid for convening all of us here today. As Jim mentioned, I'm the co-director of the Center for Effective Lawmaking, along with Craig Volden, who was on the first panel. The center is a joint research and outreach initiative between Vanderbilt University and the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy that was founded in September of 2017 to, broadly speaking, to advance the generation, communication, and use of new knowledge about the effectiveness of individual legislators and lawmaking institutions in the United States. Much of our work thus far is focused on Congress, and we've recently started to expand our focus to the U.S. state legislatures. And to do this, what we've done is essentially, it's very much a data-driven approach in which we've gone into the public record and identified every bill that was introduced by every state legislator, in some cases dating back to the 1980s, so that we're able to generate what we refer to as state legislative effectiveness scores, which capture how successful an individual member was within their legislative session at advancing their bills, which they sponsored through these different hurdles in the lawmaking process. So as a result, then, I could say with certainty that the two senators who are sitting next to me actually are extremely high performers in terms of their lawmaking effectiveness across their careers, in fact, dating back to the House as well in some cases. So it was really rewarding from my perspective, I know from Craig's perspective as well, to hear your perspectives and what contributes to effective lawmaking in Florida and Oregon respectively, because in a lot of ways what you just described is entirely consistent with our large sample data-driven research that points to what factors contribute to or detract from members of the House and Senate at the federal level, as well as at the state level, where we're starting to dive into being successful at advancing their agendas. So a couple of key elements that you raised follow very organically from our work. One deals with questions of specialization. So as the senator noted, upon being elected, I mean, all elected officials are pulled in a variety of directions with desires to represent all sorts of constituent interests. But what we've found is that those who are most successful at advancing their agendas are those who tend to focus on one issue in particular, and most of their bill portfolio focuses on one issue, and then the rest of their bills might be focused on 1 to 2 other issue areas. It might not be surprising that most people tend to be too much of a generalist, so to speak, and hence they might not be as effective as they might want to be in advancing their agendas. Bipartisanship, even in highly partisan or almost monopartisan environments, the way you described the Florida legislature, we've still found that even in these quite contentious times, being willing to reach across the aisle, strive for bipartisan co-sponsors in one's legislation helps people in trying to advance their agenda, even within the majority party. I mean, we would expect being the minority party to have to reach out to members of the majority. But we've also found that even among members of the majority party, their bills tend to go farther if they're actually bringing about a bipartisan coalition earlier in the process. Thinking about actually, I mean, as the senator put it, learning what's in the bill text. What does it mean? This speaks to broader questions of expertise, and we are able to demonstrate in our research in Congress as well as at the state level that those legislators who are aided by well-supported staff, and expertise, or staff has quite a bit of expertise, these tend to be notably more effective lawmakers in advancing the legislative agendas than in states, for example, for which the staff are not particularly well-supported. Most of the expertise has to be completely driven by in-house efforts of themselves, or at the national level when people are not able to acquire or retain really expert staff. So it's really rewarding and fascinating to hear your perspectives on what we found at the center to be conducive to a highly effective lawmaking environment. So thanks so much for spending your time here. And now to turn it back to essentially the focus of Jim's efforts at the Levin Center. I really appreciate your perspectives on lawmaking in terms of trying to advance your legislative agenda initiatives. But it goes without saying that not all of legislating is not entirely involved with trying to move bills through the legislative process. I mean, there are many important roles for those who sit in state legislatures, and one of which is oversight. And in addition to being, having really a stellar track record in terms of your ability to navigate the legislative process to advance your bills, as Jim could tell you, given his perspectives from the Levin Center, the two of you are also quite distinguished in terms of your engagement with the oversight process. So I know, Jim and I are just really fascinated to hear your perspective, and I kind of want to flip one of the earlier questions a bit. And given your perspective as really engaged with the oversight process, especially for those of us that are interested in trying to understand, how are these policies implemented? How are they being funded? How do they affect local communities and your constituents? Once again, to a newly elected legislator, either in Florida, Oregon, or more generally, what advice would you give them in terms of offering them guidance on how best to engage with the oversight process? What should they be thinking about? Why do you think this is so important? What are some best practices based on your experience?
I'll start with this story. Zig Ziglar, remember him? This kind of famous motivational speaker. He used to tell this story about this troop of people traveling through the jungle. When they're 3 months into the journey, and finally somebody decides to climb up a tree, and the guy at the bottom of the tree says, "What do you see up there?" The guy at the top of the tree looks around. Looks down, and they got Sherpas down there, and they've been carrying these gigantic packs and everything else, like for 3 months through this jungle. And the guy at the top of the tree looks around. He says, "Wrong jungle." And the guy at the bottom of the tree says, "Shut up, we're making progress." Like, oftentimes that's how the legislature is working, and how, nobody wants to be the guy at the top of the tree looking around, because that's oversight, right? That's ensuring that you're actually in the right jungle working on the right problem. So to me, it's in order to do oversight, you actually have to understand something. Right? So it comes back to, you've got to be at least somewhat of an expert in this topic, or some knowledge of who to reach out to, who are the experts in the topic. So I think it all kind of comes back to your kind of effective leadership is, one, you have to have an expert. Two, to your point earlier, you have to have a team around you, whether your immediate staff, or a legislative staff, or an external team that has a deeper knowledge of this topic in order to provide oversight. I'll give you one example in Florida. I love this example. Florida, I have pushed for years for us to, think about Florida's a state with 22 million people, 130 million tourists, and we buy a ton of cars for the state, right? The state has all these different cars. And so I pushed really hard for the state to hire a company to do all of our purchasing, all of our disposition, all of our management, because we were finding out is every state agency got a budget for cars, and they would go out and buy their own a car. And they would go out and, this guy was using Midas, this guy was using Tires Plus, this guy was using Jiffy Lube to do their car maintenance, and this guy was going to the dealership for the car maintenance. And then we were figuring out how we were going to dispose of these vehicles. Well, it turns out that there was one auto auction in Tampa, and that we were trailering vehicles from the Panhandle to Tampa, and we were spending more money to trailer the vehicles from Tampa from the Panhandle to Tampa than we were when we actually sold the vehicle. It was insane, and it still happens today. And the people that were pushing back against me were the auto dealers. Because, of course, auto dealers love that, hey, 17 different agencies are going out and paying retail price for these vehicles versus me. And I'm like, listen, there's a reason Southwest flies 737s. Every plane is 737. There's no reason that Florida is not going out to negotiate with Ford or GM or Tesla or whoever to buy 500 cars of the same type. We studied this thing. We found out Florida had like 700 cars that drove less than 300 miles last year. Right? Like, insane things that we were finding. We had cars, we were finding out agencies were holding on to cars even after they were no longer able to use. We found a car with a tree growing through it. Because if they didn't want to give that car up until they got a replacement vehicle for that vehicle. And it's just the whole like Army buying $500 toilet seats kind of thing. I mean, it's insane. But you have to understand something about the process before you can start digging into those types of things and finally climb up the tree and look around. And then understand that even when you yell and scream and you can show on paper that I could save you $50 million the first year and I can save you $15 million recurring, isn't that something you'd like, state of Florida? You're still probably going to be shot down because the auto dealers want you coming in the door to buy the vehicles.
Sorry, I'm distracted by the tree in the in the car. I think that's one of the fun things about being in the legislature is you get these images that you never possibly would have imagined. My staff would kill me if I told you the story of how I ended up unexpectedly in a room with a headless dead horse whose legs were being removed without a warning 2 weeks ago. But those are the things that we do. So I think with oversight, sometimes you stumble into it. And the biggest issue is to be willing to hear when things are not going. I think we have a bias sometimes as people that are in a system. If someone comes and tells us about a problem they're having, to say, well, that can't be the case because the law says X, Y, and Z. And at the end of the day, laws are words on paper. Implementation is what actually brings them to life. And often agencies, and I think this is an important piece, oversight isn't a gotcha. Oversight isn't based on this idea that people aren't trying to do the right thing. People are working really hard to do the right thing. And I think often when we feel like agencies are keeping information from us, they don't necessarily know that the information is there, or they're not looking at it through the same frame to be able to provide that information. So to me, oversight starts with asking really good questions when you start to hear unusual stories, so you can figure out, is this true? And if it's true, is this a one-off or is this a sign of a systemic problem? The area that I've probably done the most legislative oversight is around the Department of Human Services and the way that we do residential care for children. And when I came to the Senate, I began to chair the Human Services Committee. That's how I met Representative Stark. He also cared a lot about human services. And I was pretty alarmed by some of the ways our system was working if you looked at it from the point of view of the kids in care, their parents, or the foster parents. Things just weren't working as I thought that they should. And I was pretty frustrated with the agency, and one day I got a telephone call from a reporter that told me this terrible story about a facility, a residential facility in Portland, about kids not having food, kids being terribly abused, police coming all the time. And I was like, hey, I'm kind of irritated with the agency, but that's pretty extreme. I can't imagine that's the case. But let me go look into it. And I knew, because I actually used to work for DHS, I knew the types of public records to look for, and I knew where I could start to find things online. And when I started looking online, I could actually find reports of kids being thrown through walls. And in the midst of this reporter reported on the story, and the response from the agency really infuriated me. It said, yes, some of these things are happening, but these are some of the hardest kids to serve in the state. And this is a culturally specific program, and we need to retain our culturally specific program. And to me, that was, we have kids of color that are being thrown through walls and don't have enough food. I don't know a culture in which either of those things is culturally appropriate. And so to protect that, to be culturally specific, I have an issue with that. So I began the process of just doing a huge public records request to go through the history of the licensure of this program. And it turned out that there was a lot of fear of holding this agency accountable. They knew that they had locations that were operating without a license, that there were people that were appeared to be basically trafficking the youth that they were responsible for, but the agency couldn't do anything about it because they were like 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, and so they were above the age of consent. It was a whole series of issues, and I was able to get in touch with people that worked there and kids that came into a hearing and talked about rats, being locked outside, being sexually assaulted, having only paper towels to dry off with, staff having to go to the food bank to get food for the kids. Just totally unacceptable. These are kids that our state had taken from their parents. If we're going to take kids, we better do a better job and put them in a better place than they were before, because that's a big deal to separate a family. So clearly, it was not enough to get to the point these bad things are happening. You got to do something about it. And so we went back to the agency and started talking with them about why. Why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you do these things? And that led to a pretty comprehensive piece of legislation that in large part was written by people inside the agency saying, you know what, you haven't given us laws that are strong enough to enforce. If we go to enforce and they take it in front of an administrative law judge and they say we didn't have the authority, we're worse off than we were at the beginning because it just empowers other people to do that. So we created legislation that not only empowered the agency to take action in these things, we actually made it mandatory for them to take action in certain places. Like most things, that led to a number of facilities closing that really needed to be closed. But as time went on, got a call from another reporter that we had a bunch of kids that were being sent to out-of-state facilities. And at first, I thought it was because they were being sent to mental health programs that we didn't have in our state. Long story short, they weren't, and it was a red flag for me that our state agency couldn't tell us the names of the programs that they were in. And finally, the reporter was able to get a list that was leaked to them from someone in the agency, and I started looking it up, and these were pretty bad places where the state to the north had brought some kids home from a facility our kids were in because of physical abuse and sexual abuse. So that began a long process. And what I found when I was asking questions is when an agency is really overwhelmed, sometimes they aren't asking some of the questions, so the information wasn't readily available. Like, what are the demographics of the kids? Would anybody be surprised that the kids we were sending away were disproportionately Black, Native American, Latino, and disabled? We didn't know what the treatment plans were. We were paying a ton of money. And so I started with the agency, even though they were very frustrated with me, kind of sending out a list of questions, and we held hearings every single week for about 6 months. And then I went and personally visited some of these facilities. And it took about a year and a half, we got all of our kids back. But it really was, you need to also have a thick skin because it makes people very frustrated, especially people tend to get less emotional and defensive, I think, about cars than they do about kids. And if you're pulling in child abuse, racism, sexism, ableism, people start to feel attacked really quickly, and that's a very difficult balance to find too. And the last part that I would say is I realized early on, conflict makes people uncomfortable. And so you have to figure out how to keep the focus on the issue, because it can't become about which party is right and which party is wrong. Who's going to win, the Human Services Chair or the Director of the Department of Human Services? It wasn't about either of us. It was about a bunch of kids. It was about some for-profit corporations that were frankly fleecing our state. And it was about abuse. And we mattered very little. What mattered was those kids. And that can be a very challenging thing to move yourself out of, because it's easy to become defensive too when you're being pushed back on by the agency.
There's a lot of incredibly important content in there, and I want to push both of you a bit further to reinforce some of the points the senator was raising, especially the notion that, as you put it, I really like the phrase that oversight isn't really a gotcha moment, so to speak. It's really focused on efficacy of implementation. And to that degree, and building on a question that was raised a little bit earlier in regards to lawmaking, I'd be curious to hear your perspectives on the extent to which bipartisan oversight is constructive, or how helpful it is to really be engaging in oversight and bringing in representatives from both sides of the aisle. Have you found that to be constructive? Does that pose particular challenges, especially in arguably contentious times?
No, I think, listen, in Florida at least, it is the number one role the Democrats play is oversight. They're not going to pass a lot of bills, but they can they can tour prisons and they can see what the problems are. To kind of make it recent, last year we passed a bill that says, Florida, we gave the governor $12 million to, he asked for this, but he wanted $12 million to move immigrants that are illegal immigrants out of the state of Florida. And the law literally says you can only use these dollars if they are from this state. So we flew people from Texas to Martha's Vineyard. Those people were not from this state. And so if you look at the flight path of that airplane, it went from Texas, it landed in Florida for 20 minutes, and then it flew to Martha's Vineyard. And so we go, well, okay, let's make even the boldest argument that yes, it was allowed for you to bring them, and we can pay for the flight from Florida to Martha's Vineyard, right? I would argue you can't immigrate people to export them. Right, but let's just say even the broadest interpretation of from the state is that you can fly them from Texas from Florida to Martha's Vineyard. Who paid for the flight from Texas to Florida? Because clearly the state doesn't authorize that. So to highlight your point, what's going on right now is my best friend, also my roommate, is in the middle of a lawsuit with the governor over those words from the state on whether we can continue to fly people from Texas to Florida at $10,000 a pop, which you could probably fly them to Singapore cheaper, then we could fly them from on these types of flights. So I think what it highlights is the role that they play is extremely important in the oversight space, and I think it highlights their role is, especially in the minority, is to point out the majority's failures, because the majority will not do the incentive for the majority is to be quiet, right? Like the leadership wants docile. They don't want dissent in their ranks. I always tell people that at least the House is like a military organization in a Republican majority. It's got its generals, its colonels, its captains, and its soldiers. And the Senate should operate much more like Somalian warlords, right? There should be territories, there should be factions, there should be, that's how this thing should play out, right? We should have friends, as you said, our friends aren't permanent, but these factions should grow and shrink. And there should be some question about whether bills are going to pass or not. There should be some conflict, even amongst the body itself, Republicans or Democrats, in a small organization like a Senate, because it's not 120 members of the House and top-down organized. It should be more. There should be more conflict inside of it. And so, in that body, the Democrats, the minority should play a very important role of bringing up some of the challenges that seize the majority.
Thank you.
So our experience was a little different. I'm a Democrat in a state that at that time had a supermajority in both the House and the Senate, and a Democratic governor and an entire Democratic administration. So it's a little bit of an awkward thing to be a Democratic leader pushing back very publicly and very hard against your own your own party leadership. The Republican Party actually was very important in putting this together, and it went back to some of those pieces of trust and the conversations around, do we want a headline or do we want to get something done? So as you can imagine, many of these things were really very, very potent. And I ended up putting together, there was a guy who had reached out to me, and he put together this big briefing on these out-of-state placements and these companies that were doing things. And I reached out to a couple of Republicans, including one that had a very, very savvy public media, social media person, and said, hey, would you hold your fire for just a little bit, and if we have this kind of embargoed meeting where we all come, and what if we make a plan together? I was like, I totally understand you've got a job to do. If it's the politics, that's fine. I really want to change this, and could you help me do that? I need a little bit more space before it blows up. And they were willing to do that, and they came and participated. When we started having the hearings, I invited Republicans and Democrats that weren't on my committee that had interest in it to come and sit on the committee, including from the other chamber as well. Worked really hard to keep people updated on what it was that we were doing, what was coming next, what we were finding, and worked really hard when I worked with DHS to get letters to allow me to go into these facilities across the country to make sure that colleagues in both parties and both chambers had that same ability to do that. Eventually, I ended up traveling with my Republican vice chair and the Department of Human Services on some of these trips, and that really, it was right before COVID too. It was January of 2020. That was a really important thing, and I think really a breakthrough moment in moving from conflict to everybody kind of being on the same page moving forward, because when you're in the same room, it's less easy for people to triangulate you, and it was easier for people to see the side that we were all on. So it really does take all the parties, because we're all there for all the people. And I do want to say, I'd said the thing earlier about no permanent friends and no permanent enemies. I think we have political friends and political enemies, and there are some people that believe that you can't have real friendships or real relationships within a legislative body or across party lines. I don't believe that that's true. I know there are some people I won't be in touch with later, but some of these folks are some of the most important people in my life. And sometimes, actually, in general, the people with whom I have the most longstanding relationships are those whose voting records are least like my own.
Thank you. I just want to take a minute or so before I pass it on to Daniel. Jim, I really want to make sure we didn't conclude the panel without you spending a couple of minutes just telling us about the Mission 11 Center, the work you're doing at the state level, and really the extent to which what we're hearing from these legislators comports with your experiences about what contributes to effective oversight.
Well, Alan, thank you, and thank you to our panelists for really opening up this issue of how legislating and oversight link, and how they are really opposite sides of the same coin. At the Levin Center, over the past 7 years now, going on 8 years, we have been training both members of Congress, staff in Congress, and state lawmakers and staff in how to conduct bipartisan fact-based oversight. We also conduct research, both related to Congress, but also to the state legislatures, about what works and what doesn't work in oversight. And we defend the right of Congress to hold the executive branch accountable. And finally, we work with students from high school to law school, giving them an exposure to what legislative oversight is all about, to help us train the next generation of leaders who will see that, as Sarah said, it does not end with passing a bill. In fact, that's the beginning. And the way we view oversight, and really, if we had more time, I'd really take you through a set of best practices that we advocate for. But to kind of sum them up, check your echo chamber at the door. If you're going to do good oversight, you're going to do much more powerful and well-informed oversight if you don't allow your ideological and political and partisan biases to dominate the work. The more you can invite the other side of the aisle into the process, the stronger the process will be, the more well-informed it will be, and the more credible the output will be. The public and the media will have a much more respectful, and they will take much more account of what your conclusions are if they were arrived at in a bipartisan fashion. I think I'll save the rest of it maybe for the final, comments. But I just think this is a tremendous opportunity to really bring both sides of this equation together, the legislative side and the oversight side, to really reveal that essentially your work as a lawmaker is really not done ever, and that ultimately oversight is about a 360 version of accountability, that lawmakers are really looking back at themselves and looking at the results of their own work and whether those policies are actually accomplishing what they were designed to accomplish. So I'll turn it back over.
Good. Why don't we have our panel stay up there? I'll just make a few closing remarks. First off, I want to thank the lawmakers for being with us today. I'll come back to some of your wisdom that you shared with us. I also want to thank colleagues at the Levin Center, the Center for Effective Lawmaking, and the Millennial Action Project for co-hosting, my teammates from Longwell Partners for being here and helping us get organized. Very much appreciative of that, and the partnership, our friends at the partnership, for hosting us. But one of our initial projects that we're also thinking about is addressing this need, which Representative Pittman and Senator Montgomery flagged early on, which is and Senator Brandis spoke to it also, the extent to which newly elected, especially first-time lawmakers, are almost like the dog that caught the car. Like, okay, what happens now? And so I was going to try and pull together some grand themes, but actually, so we're thinking about writing a book that could kind of be a handbook for people that are shifting from campaigning to now leading and governing. And I kind of went through my notes and assembled some quotations from our lawmakers that actually provide a very good table of contents here. So let me just share a few of these with you. You have to search out common ground. Where can you agree? You really get to need to know your fellow lawmakers. It's all about relationships. Governance is about patience and persistence. You've got to learn and understand how the system works. There are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies in politics. You can't get everything you want all at once. Know what your legislative agenda is. Focus on the outcomes you want to achieve. Pick a topic, learn more about it than anyone else, and become indispensable. Read the bill. Every word on the bill matters. Politics is like theater. We all have lines we need to say at certain points, but don't take it personally. Climb up the tree and look around. That's what oversight is. And laws are words on paper. Implementation is what brings them to life. So those are some really, I think, some hard-won insights there that you shared with us. We're very grateful for your time and being with us here today. And before I close out, our colleague Layla has an invitation for really everyone here, including the folks who are joining remotely. And I don't know if we've queued the slide up, but Layla, do you want to come up and speak to that?
Yeah. Well, very quickly, thank you so much, Daniel. I echo everyone and just your leadership putting this together. But I'm just going to stand here. People can hear me, right? You don't need the microphone. We're having an event tomorrow to celebrate several lawmakers from our network who have been just tremendous leaders in doing exactly what we've been talking about today, which is how do you be an effective lawmaker. We will be recognizing the Oklahoma Future Caucus, so you got to meet 2 of them today. They will be accepting the award along with their colleagues tomorrow, as well as 2 individuals, one from Arkansas, Rep. Aaron Pilkington, and one from Alabama, Rep. Jeremy Gray. I hope all of you can join us, if not to celebrate these lawmakers, because there will be free food and drinks. So, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for being here.